Hey guys, welcome to the channel. Omar here, and today's episode is a little different. I got a DM from a subscriber named Sohail, all the way from Pakistan. What's up, Yar? And the gist of the DM was, how feasible would it be to shoot with a 50mm lens handheld when it comes to video? His old camera fizzled out. Price differences between a GH4 and GH5 are crazy over there. And so today I'm going to show you on my Fujifilm X-T3 how I would always shoot with no stabilization whatsoever, using only a couple of accessories that come with the camera. Don't worry about the strap, we'll talk about that. And that'll give everyone a good visual representation of what to expect with these different techniques. Now, this is the Fujifilm 33mm f1.4. The 25-1.7 that Sohail is going to be using is a 50mm, and it renders at around f3.5, so it's a pretty shallow depth of field. 50mm is not what I would consider wide. That's the beginning of medium telephoto to me. So if you don't want your footage to be jarring, you have to pay very close attention to how you're holding your camera. Now, to establish a baseline, I'm going to be shooting my XH2S that I'm recording this on now. Let's get rid of this, and I'm going to show you what it's like when you just shoot with the camera away from your body, which is definitely not what I would recommend anyone do. And as you can see here, I'm holding it straight as much as I can. It's pretty shaky. The first thing you got to do is think of your body as a stabilizer and shock absorber for the most part, where it has to absorb those micro jitters and those little movements you just saw. So instead of shooting like this, you're going to bring the camera as close to your body as possible. Like if you got a flip out screen, you can actually press the flip out screen against you. If you have a flip out screen, I think it's a lot better because you get more of the camera body on you. Loosen your elbows up a bit. Ooh, starting to get nuts. Loosen your elbows up. I don't know if you can see it here, but you don't want to leave your legs locked. You want to actually have a slight bend in your knee. And now let's see what the difference is here. Now, you'll notice that here it is off my body. And here it is when the camera is actually making contact with my body. It's a little hard to see with the X-T3 screen, but you can see that it's considerably more stable. And the reason for that is that there are more points of contact between the camera body and my body. Basically, when it comes to this, the more points of contact you have, the more stable your footage is going to be when you're shooting handheld. Now, adding a little motion is always nice too. Here's me rocking back and forth using the technique where it's a little closer to my body. And here's me doing the same thing when it's actually on my body. Now the question becomes, how do I have stable footage if I'm going to be shooting for more than a couple of seconds without like straining my arms or without losing vision on the back of the LCD? And the answer is the strap that I put away. So let me go bring that back right now. Now this is my Peak Design strap. I've had this thing for years, and it actually doesn't matter what strap you have. In my opinion, actually the OEM strap that comes with cameras is much better for this than the aftermarket ones because they're a little more flexible. And I'll show you why in a second. So there are a couple of ways to do this. This is like the standard way where you're going to make sure that the strap is taut against the back of your neck. Obviously don't like put a lot of strain on it. You don't want to give yourself a disc for no reason. And like this, and you put some pressure on it with your arms, it puts it at a good distance away from you, and it's incredibly stable. The thing is, for me, this is A, not like the most comfortable thing in the world, and B, it's a little impractical in certain situations. So what I like to do is actually cinch it against my arm. Plus I like shooting low. So I cinch this against my arm. And then the same concept goes where you see how tight it is? Like this is now a very stable rig, and then I have another point of contact here. So we still have 3 points of contact now without it being pressed up against my body. It gives you a lot more flexibility that way. Okay, hitting the record button. And as you can see, I can now get like a low angle hero shot doing this. Typically, I wouldn't go above 35mm, but I am trying to match Sohail's setup so he can see what the handheld iteration, what to expect when he's doing this handheld, although he did say he was going to look into getting a stabilizer as well. So this is a pretty good setup as is, and I have a cage, by the way. None of this requires a cage. I just permanently mounted my X-T3 in there. Well, not permanently, but you put a tiny screw in and it's annoying to take out. And that is how I like using straps, those two particular ways. Easy way would definitely be this one here. Obviously, it does not have to be this far out. You can bring it in if you wanted to. So you can bring it in, and this also gives you a lot more flexibility, like if you want to get low angle shots, if you want to do certain movements, which with a 50 I really wouldn't recommend, but here's what it looks like. And that is how your factory strap, the one that comes with the camera, can be just super handy in helping you get those really stable shots. Another technique when it comes to handheld is moving with purpose, which is what you just saw me do on a couple of those shots. If you actually go back and watch pretty much any movie or TV series that you enjoy, you'll see that there's actually camera movement in almost every frame. It's incredibly rare for them to just be on a tripod and to shoot accordingly. There's always just a little bit of intentional movement, and it just makes the scene feel so much more natural. So I'm gonna step in a little closer, and I'm gonna utilize, let's go with the arm technique again. I'm moving with intention. Right now I wanna do like an orbital shot. And it's always going to be slower movement. Slower movement. You're gonna try to stay as tight as possible. And generally it ends up looking pretty good. Now let me try aiming here. I'll lock the focus so we can see me moving. And I'm sorry if I flinch because there are bugs all over the place here. But the intentional movement, it makes everything better. Here's me with a slight push in. And Fuji's less than incredible tracking autofocus on the X-T3. Here's me moving back. Let me pick an angle that's a little less challenging for it. Tracking shot going in. Obviously it's a little easier when you're further out. And there may be a reason why you would want to do that, and we'll go over that in a minute. Okay, so the next one, not rocket science, but we're going to take a little walk here. And it's using your environment for support. Now what this means, let me see what angle I can get, is say you have a wall around you. If you actually just lean against it, here, let's go with this technique here. This is just a great default. With me using this wall right here, and it's considerably less strenuous. I'm just shooting like a camera over here. You can imagine if someone's talking, if you're doing sports, people will be paying attention to the action in the center of the frame or wherever it is you're positioning your subject. And well, you're not going to be shooting sports when you're leaned up against a wall, and so if you're doing something, which again, I wouldn't recommend if you could avoid it, but if you're going to be shooting for an extended period, and extended to me is anything over 30 seconds at this focal length, then finding something to lean against is going to be really handy. So now I'm using the arm strap technique and I'm leaning. Also helps, by the way, to control your breathing. Kind of like, well, if you're American, you probably know this, kind of like when you're shooting a gun. Sorry, rest of the world. Okay, and we're done. So for the most part, this is what you're going to be able to do without spending any more money. Personal suggestion, not going to include it here, but if you get a very basic monopod, it actually introduces a lot of stabilization and takes a lot of the weight off your upper back and your neck, so you're not like always hunched over. And monopods are really inexpensive. You can get a brand new one for like 20 USD. You can get a used one off Facebook Marketplace for like 5 USD if they're not giving it up for free. And in addition to that, and one of my favorite things about monopods is that they allow you to get leverage. So you can actually get a really high shot, which is really handy when you're on the go. Typically, if I have the option between carrying a tripod or carrying a monopod, I always carry the monopod, and that's actually pretty standard gear for me if you ever run into me on the streets. Now, the last thing we're going to cover on how to enhance your stabilization is what I would do in post-production, and that's warp stabilization, or whatever the warp stabilization equivalent is in your editing software or app. And yes, phone apps now do have warp stabilization, and they can color correct log footage. So I think in 10 years, we have an interesting workflow we could potentially be looking at. Warp stabilization, while a very valid approach and a technique that's only gotten better with time, that is the last thing you want to do. And there are a couple of reasons for that, but the two big ones are, number one, it only works so well. If you've ever seen a video where you see a bit of a jello effect and you're not entirely certain why there's like a weird wave on the footage that you're watching, it's because they applied warp stabilizer to footage that is just too shaky. Second reason is that if you become accustomed to fixing things in post, and this is why the memes exist, then your process becomes worse and worse and your shots become sloppier and sloppier, and eventually you might end up start making mistakes irregularly thinking you can fix it in post. And if it becomes something that you can't reshoot or can't reshoot for cheap or free, it will become a problem, especially if you're doing this for a paid client. So warp stabilization is the absolute last thing you want to do. And also, just so everyone knows, warp stabilization works better if it has more frames to work with. So if you're shooting 24 FPS, your footage can't be too shaky, but if you're shooting slow motion, 120 frames per second, then you'll actually come out with a much smoother image than you would out of like a 24 or 30p. My other recommendation is that if you do need to apply warp stabilization, try to apply it in sections of a clip instead of an entire clip. Also, if you know for a fact you're going to have to end up using warp stabilizer in post because of the environment or because of how much movement there is due to your distance in the subject or whatever, there are two things you should keep in mind while you're actually shooting the video. Number one is take a step back and give the subject more breathing room, because warp stabilizer sacrifices a bit of field of view, a couple of pixels, in order to stabilize the footage. The second thing is when you're going to move, like if you're doing this for a product shot or if you're taking a step because you don't have a gimbal or stabilizer, you should move very, very, very slowly and use the highest frame rate that you can without like really downgrading the video or whatever the case is. So on this camera, for example, if I'm shooting in 4K 24, I'm going to switch over to 4K 60 if I do have to introduce a fair amount of movement, because I know for a fact that's going to get me more stable footage. I know that the 120 FPS will get me the most stable footage, but the problem with that is that on this camera, it's 1080p, and that's something you do have to take into consideration based on what you're going to be exporting the project in and what the deliverables look like. So in conclusion, make sure that your elbows and your knees are bent and they're acting as shock absorbers for the camera and all the micro jitters. If you have your strap, use it as a third point of contact. That way it prevents the camera from moving around and you're giving it some force there. Third thing, make sure that all your movement is intentional and you're not giving it like jerky motions, because you're not going to be able to recover that. Fourth, if you see a wall or any other stationary object, use it for support. And number 5, warp stabilizer in post, but you know, only if you really have to. With that being said, like and subscribe, and I will catch you guys at the next one. Peace.